Welcome to another episode of Yu-Gi-Oh! Player Ranks. In this series, we rank various Yu-Gi-Oh! Themes based on your comments and suggestions. Come back every tier list Tuesday to see an all-new installment of this series. Alright guys, I am back with another tier list. This metagame the last few weeks has been absolutely insane. We have a pack that dropped that completely changed everything. It is one of the most insane pack drops yet. We have for the first time a tier 0 deck. Which is insane. On top of that, they had a ban list that I thought was the worst ban list we've had yet in Master Duel, because it didn't actually address the main deck. It addressed a million little decks, but not the main deck. But let's not waste too much time. One thing I will say, I'm going to be brutally honest in this tier list. If you can't handle the honesty, no other YouTuber will tell you this. Just leave. This is an honest tier list. You can go watch happy news from somebody else right off the bat. Tearlaments is a tier 0 deck. The only decks that compete with this deck, first of all, let's just say this deck is probably the greatest engine of any deck we've ever seen. It is absolutely insane. It's like what Lightsworn should have been. It's literally that outrageous. Your opponent activates, mill 3 cards. It's like your opponent activates a monster effect, mill 3 cards. If this card gets milled, fusion summon. The materials, you banish them so you can't use them again? Of course not. You shuffle them back into decks so you could recycle them. On top of that, you have the Ishizu cards, which mill 5 cards out of nowhere for free. This deck is absolutely insane. The engine's insane. The deck just is crazy, and it's even crazier in Master Duel, because literally the coin flip doesn't even matter, because if you lose the coin flip, they can always have this. They can mill still anyway. The deck is just outrageous. Literally, the only thing, like I said, that beats this deck is floodgates. And almost all of the floodgates in Master Duel have been hit in some way. Dimensional Shifter is at 2. The what's it called? Flanderies have been hit so many different times. They lost the barrier statue. The map's at 1. All of the natural counters to this deck, every floodgate that is good is basically at 1. Everything that could possibly counter this deck. On top of that, Bystials, which are a part of the Despia archetype, those aren't even out yet. They are the natural counter to this deck. They don't exist yet. You're stuck playing DD Crow, which is nowhere near as good, unfortunately. So the deck is just in a atrociously strong position, especially for Master Duel. And on top of that, like I said, the only thing that can really beat them are floodgates. Here's the frustrating part about them. They talk about how much skill the Tearlament deck takes. If we're being honest, they end on an Abyss Dweller or a Baguska every single time, or a Winda. They also play floodgates. So on top of complaining about floodgates, they play floodgates themselves. It's monstrous. A lot of people say, "Oh, this is such a high skill. It's such a high skill, unbelievably high skill mirror match." The reality is, they click buttons like the rest of us. Things pop up on the screen. Would you like to fuse? Yeah. Would you like to mill? Yeah. Who's gonna say no? Let's be honest. Who's gonna say no? If you mill a Havness, are you gonna say no? I don't want to fuse. Come on. So they act like it's a DDD mirror match. Now that's high skill. If you want a DDD mirror match, you can't even keep up watching it. It's incredible. But this deck, like I said, by far the greatest deck ever. It's like the Michael Jordan of decks. It's so much better than every other deck that we have ever seen played. Probably we're going to be telling our grandkids about Tearlaments. That's how good it is. Outrageously good deck. By far the best. Vernisloofs are, consider building something else. No, the deck is not bad. But generally speaking, you're going to play Vernisloofs in other decks. So you're going to play it in Madolches, you're going to play it in Adamancipators, you're going to play it in Naturias when they drop everything for Naturias. It's actually pretty good in that, but alone, don't play this deck solo. Don't play this by itself. It's just, there's not enough going on. Ishizus are the same way. Broken cards, absolutely insane, but you're not playing these on their own. You're playing them in Tearlaments. Another thing I will say about Tearlaments, not only do they actually use floodgates themselves, but they shut down other graveyard decks. Isn't that frustrating? If you're playing another graveyard deck, like Lightsworn or Orcust, they have these stupid Ishizu cards that can shuffle away all of your stuff whenever they want to. That's another really annoying part about the deck. It's like a cannibal. Everything that it's like, everything that it says it hates, it actually is very good against itself, which is really frustrating. Fluffles, this is another discussion. I used to put this in tier 3. This is a rogue deck. They got hit on the ban list. They tried to hit tier elements, they missed, and they accidentally hit Fluffle Bear right between the eyes. This deck got hit. Unfortunately, there's a few cards that are very important to this deck, one of which very integral to the deck is the Foolish Burial Goods. You need to send Toy Vendor, and that helps you go off. Unfortunately, that got hit. That's one of their main play starters. Really frustrating. On top of that, the Ishizu Shufflers are absolutely disgusting against this deck. Another really frustrating thing. And it's a going second deck, so it's not like you can go first and then, you know, kind of plan around things. You have to go second. The whole point is to OTK your opponent, so you go second, and then everything just goes down the drain because they shuffle everything away as you play. Even they used to tech things like Eldritch the Golden Lord. Pointless. There's no point. They're going to shuffle it away. There's no point. You activate Eldritch, send it to grave, shuffle it right back in the deck. See you, Eldritch. It's terrible. This is Amazonas. This is one of the new cards in the... I'm going to put it in Rogue. This is one of the new decks that have been released in the new pack with tier elements. This is the stuff when you pull in, you're like, damn, why'd I get this instead of a tier element? This is what you're pulling. So the deck itself isn't actually that bad. I actually think the deck is quite good. The problem with this deck is it's first of all, it's like a beatdown strategy. And if you don't know what a beatdown strategy is, we're talking like 2006, 2007 Yu-Gi-Oh, where you basically just your goal was just to summon big monsters and attack over your opponent's monsters until you can get enough direct attack ins to win. And that was like, it's like a really old, like just generally a really old strategy in Yu-Gi-Oh. It hasn't really been represented or seen play in a very long time. But that's what this deck basically does. It puts a bunch of monsters that protect each other onto the board. It does fusion summons. It has some new pendulum monsters, but you're not actually pendulum summoning. You're just using their like pendulum effects. But overall, the deck is actually quite cool. One big problem with this deck is the deck needs, and I mean this, the deck needs Goes in Match and Rivalry. Every monster is an Earth and a Warrior, and without those, the deck is just too slow to actually compete in the metagame. You can make it to, like, obviously you can make it to like Platinum and go through Platinum. If your opponent doesn't read your cards, you know, you can do your thing. But for the most part, if your opponent actually knows how to play against Amazonas, they'll just absolutely demolish you. And like I said, because of the previous metagames, those floodgates have been hit, and now, you know, decks like this can't really compete. Adignister's another one. I probably put it in Rogue, maybe tier 3. Like if you go first and you set up the monsters unaffected by everything, the Arrival at Ignister, like you probably will win against tier elements. But if you're going second and they have Ishizu Shufflers in graveyard, that's a problem. A lot of your cards, this deck has a lot of recursion. It has negates that activate in the graveyard. It has protection that activates in the graveyard. It has a lot of things that need to be put in the graveyard to make this deck playable. And if you don't have that, like even the field spot, like the deck needs the graveyard and needs to keep its cards in the graveyard. And if you can't do that, you can't win. And its Shizu cards are absolutely disgusting against this deck in particular. The only deck that can one of the only decks that can actually compete with tier elements is Fluundereeze. If we had Fluundereeze at full power, we're talking Barrier Statue, 3 copies of Dimensional Shifter, 3 copies of Map. I still don't think that this deck would even be that good. I think it'd still be in the exact same position. Like the truth about this deck is, if you open D-Shifter, you probably will win against tier elements. If you don't open D-Shifter, you're going to have a very rough road. You still have M-Pen, which is very good. If you're a smart player, you have Ryza, so you can, you know, get rid of their normal summon, shuffle it back, put it on top of their deck. You can do some cool stuff with this deck for sure. But again, it's one of the only decks that can actually compete with tier elements, and it's simply because it plays D-Shifter. And unfortunately, that's what we're down to. Like, if your deck can play D-Shifter, you can compete in the metagame. If it can't, you're in trouble, buddy. This is another deck. I used to put it in tier 3. I'm probably going to put it in Rogue. Unfortunately, I'm going to be honest with you. Again, the Shufflers are probably the worst. Tier elements affects every deck differently. The worst part for this, every deck has essentially gotten hit just through tier elements coming out. So the problem for this deck is the Shufflers. Like, shuffling away your babies, shuffling away all of the monsters before you can banish them out of the graveyard to summon Ultimate Conductor Tyranno, shuffling away everything before you can activate the effect of Miscellaneous Swords. Like, that just hurts the deck. That is a part of the core strategy of Dinosaurs. If you can't do that, you can't play. So that's the reality with Dinosaurs. And again, there's two different ways to play Dinosaurs. Going first, Dinosaurs, going second, Dinosaurs, going second. The OTK one isn't going to work because, again, they're just going to shuffle everything before you can OTK anybody. And if you're going first with Dinosaurs, you're trying to set up like kind of like a mid-range board. Again, it's not the worst idea ever, but it's again, against tier limits, it's just not that great. And everybody's main decking DD Crow. You know what DD Crow is good against? Dinosaurs. Caught in the crossfire. This pack, never play this deck pure. It's absolutely unplayable. You cannot play this deck pure. You could play it in other stuff, but don't play it pure. As far as representation this meta, I have not seen a lot of representation of. I don't think I've seen a single soul activate this card. Activate any of the adventure package since tier limits have dropped. Now, that might be for a variety of reasons. I don't know what it is exactly, but I mean, when you have more bricks than you have engine starters in this archetype, it probably leads to some trouble. Next is, this is Legendary Ocean Control, Kairyu-Shin Control. I would have put this in tier 3. I personally, this season, I've been playing just this deck, and I got to Diamond with this deck, and I went undefeated against a lot of tier limit players for a very, very long time. But I am including the new ban list, so unfortunately that new ban list really hits this deck badly. They got rid of, again, Foolish Burial Goods. You use that to send Ice Barrier, you banish Ice Barrier to search Kairyu-Shin or Gamma-Seal. Now that is gone, so because Foolish Burial Goods is gone, there's no point to actually play Ice Barrier because, like, what are you going to do? Like, draw it for turn, set it, hope your opponent attacks, and then banish it out of the graveyard, and then turn 4, you get to actually get a Kairyu-Shin to your board. It's just not very optimal. The searchable Kaiju is kind of irrelevant now. There's really no point to play it, so you can't search a Kaiju. You know, instead of having, before you had how many copies of Kairyu-Shin? You basically had 9 copies of Kairyu-Shin. With the Foolish Burial Goods going to 1, you now have 7 copies of Kairyu-Shin. Kairyu-Shin is not only a copy of Kairyu-Shin, it's also a copy of every single card that has Umi in its text. So you basically have, it multiplies the amount of cards that you have in your deck that have Umi in its text. So instead of having, like, for example, 3 copies of Sea Stealth, you now have 6 copies of Sea Stealth because you can basically search at any time with Kairyu-Shin. All of that entire consistency web has been completely shattered. It no longer exists. You have to do foolish and goofy things to actually get to the cards you want. So you have to do things like play foolish. You have to play things like, if you want to play this deck, you have to play things like Reasoning and Monster Gate and a bunch of other dumb garbage like that. So to actually just get to what we used to get to, but now less consistently. So the deck unfortunately got hit, and I'm probably going to have to be switching off this deck. It's probably my last season playing this deck, unfortunately. Like I said, it's gotten me to Diamond, and it got me through the attribute thing, but now it's essentially gone. Next is Madolche's. Madolche's is a very good deck. I think Madolche is actually better than most of these other decks. You can even make the arguments tier 3. Maybe I'll put it in tier 3. Tier 3 is still, you know, it's salvageable. Madolche's is very good. Yeah, Madolche is a very strong deck. It's very good because of the Vernisloofs, and it's very good because of the Ichizu cards. It doesn't get boosted as much as tier limits, but the good thing is it doesn't really get hurt by the Ichizu package. So if you're playing against you're playing against tier limits and they're playing the Ichizu package, like, it doesn't actually hurt Madolche's all that much because it's like, please shuffle my cards back. I get to search. I get to set a card directly to my zone. Like, I don't really care. Go ahead, please. I would love for you to shuffle back my monsters back into my deck. It's the greatest feeling. But yeah, the deck overall is pretty strong. Makes a pretty strong board. Yeah, definitely. I'd say tier 3, maybe top of Rogue, but definitely somewhere up there. This is another deck that kind of got hit. I've actually seen it, funny enough. I probably put it in Rogue. This is the Thousand Eyes Restrict archetype. I've actually seen somebody play it with the tier limit deck, like mix Thousand Eyes plus tier elements, but honestly, it was just a worse version of just tier elements. If I'm being completely honest, Yeah, it was kind of okay. They did lose Instant Fusion, which sucks because Instant Fusion used to be a copy of Millennium Eyes or Thousand Eyes, and now that is gone. So gone once again. Sprites are probably tier 3. I think the only like real tier 2 deck is probably going to be the this is the only deck that like actually contends with this deck. Sprites are still a very strong deck and you have to respect it, especially if you're not playing tier limits. Then you have to respect. The thing is, this tier list changes if you are not playing tier limits. This tier list is completely different, because if you're not playing tier limits, then you actually have to respect sprites. You actually have to respect Madolches. You actually have to respect Legendary Ocean and Dinosaurs and all this other stuff. You actually have to like sit here and think and play against this stuff. But if you're playing tier limits, it just basically wrecks all these other decks. Sprites is still very good. The problem with Sprite is it's just not as good as tier limit. Like straight up, it is just not as good as tier limit. It came pre-hit. And then on top of that, you don't have Totally Awesome, which is totally the GOAT, and you don't have him. He would have been great to have, but unfortunately he is gone. Tier limits actually use Sprite Elf better than regular sprites do. It's almost insane. That card is so splashable and so abusable in other decks that it should actually probably be gone. Next is Final Countdown. This might be the worst deck on the whole tier list. There is not a chance you're lasting 20 turns against tier limits. Who are you kidding? This card's limited to 1, and you got to last 20 turns against tier limits. Are you joking with me? They'd have to help you for you to pull this off. That's how bad it is. Next is Crystal Beast, another deck caught in the crossfire. Honestly, though, I think this is actually... So, again, this is a deck that before the ban list, I would have put in tier 3. Why? They can use D-Shifter, they can use There Can Only Be One, they can use most of the floodgates that are good against tier limits. Very good. And they can actually search with Foolish Burial Goods. They can actually search Necro Valley and Zombie World. Necro Valley and Zombie World both have good effects against tier limits because it changes the attribute. I mean, Zombie World changes the type of the monsters in the graveyard. So it basically changes the Aqua monsters to zombie monsters, which that can be helpful. And then Necro Valley obviously is very good against tier limits. So if you go first, you set up Necro Valley, you basically can almost guarantee yourself a win against tier limits, because they actually aren't playing a lot of like back row outs, other than like their main stuff, which is in-engine stuff they actually have to like search and draw and get to, which they can't do if the graveyard shut down. So that is pretty good against tier limits. The problem is Foolish Burial Goods got hit on the ban list. And this deck with Foolish Burial Goods can literally search any field spell in the entire game, and you can't do it anymore because Foolish Burial Goods is limited to 1. So now you have to play just as many bricks as you are playing starters, and that is never a good combination. So that is incredibly unfortunate for the deck. This deck can still play D-Shifter and stuff like that, so it is still a strong deck. I just wish that did not happen, but you have to live with the reality. Yeah, there is the card. I keep forgetting its name, but there is a card. This is a trap card that is very good in this deck that you can basically banish and search a Crystal Beast monster, and you can search any field spell in the game. And that card was absolutely amazing for this deck, and now it's completely gone, along with, you know, other things. So I'd probably say, honestly though, this deck can still probably be in tier 3. I'd probably put it at the top of Rogue, but it's definitely one of the better Rogue decks. Again, everything in this tier list is basically in relation to how good it is against tier limits. This is another deck that I could probably put this in tier 2. It's another deck that it has a really good tier limit matchup. Basically, this deck, number 1, it can run D-Shifter, so automatically puts it a step above. But on top of that, this is one of those decks where it's like every single time your opponent touches the graveyard, you get to do something, which is fantastic, because that's just about anything that tier limits does anyway. So definitely like a tier 2, very good deck. Good matchup against tier limits. Might be tier 3, honestly, but I probably put in like tier 3. It probably is still not better than Sprite, and it's definitely not better than Floowandereeze against tier limits, so I'd probably say it's somewhere in tier 3. Next is Gravekeepers. Now you would think this would be the time to shine for Gravekeepers. It's never going to get any better than it is right now. The best deck in the game hard loses to Necro Valley, but I'm going to tell you right now, it's still not good enough. This deck has had the same problem for the last, I don't know, 20 years. Literally the same problem. The problem is you have to go first. That's it. That is the problem. This deck needs something like... It needs something like a Necro Banshee. Maybe not in a graveyard, but it needs something like the zombie world card, the Necro Banshee. It needs something like that, where you can like banish, activate Necro Valley directly from deck. This card cannot be negated by Necro Valley. That's what it needs. Either that or quick effect in hand. Send this card to the graveyard. Activate Necro Valley directly from deck. This deck needs something like that. Otherwise, it will literally never be playable. Because the problem is, as good as this deck is at shutting down the graveyard, if you're going second, it's too damn late to shut down the graveyard. Tier limits have already set up a board, and now what are you going to do? Like, seriously, what are you going to do? They have an Omni Negate. They have a Summon Negate. Like, they have other interruptions. What in the world are you going to do now? You're going to activate Necro Valley? Great. They're just going to pop it. They're going to pop it with their field spell. They're going to pop it with something else. Like, it's just not good. That's the problem with this deck, is it just doesn't... It's not good enough at that. And I probably put it somewhere in, like, Rogue. Even this is the best possible time to play it, and it's still not good enough. It's obnoxious. This is probably in Tier 3. Yes, the deck benefits somewhat from having their cards sent to the graveyard, which your opponent will do for you with the Shizu cards. But the problem is those shufflers will just kill any grind game that you have. The trap card, they can shuffle back. The trap card, they can shuffle back. The stove, the clock, all those like weird ones, all of those they can shuffle back. Basically, all of the cards that you can basically recycle and reuse, you can just quick effect shuffle back into your opponent, can just quick effect shuffle back into your deck, and now you can't even play it. Still probably one of the better trap decks available to you, and depending on the situation, it might, actually be a decent matchup against tier limits sometimes, but I don't think it's good enough. Honestly, I probably put it in Rogue, like top of Rogue, but it's definitely a very good deck. It's definitely something you have to watch out for if you're not playing tier limits, but if you are, you probably have a pretty good out to this deck. Again, the other thing that hits this deck pretty hard is they hit all of the floodgates over the last few months, or the last year actually, because of Eldritch and because of that other stun deck, Runic. So Runic and Eldritch got all of the floodgates basically hit, banned, limited, whatever the situation is. And now this deck, which would have very, very much been so much better off if it had things like Goes in Match at 3 and Rivalry at 3 and Skill Drain at 3 and just stuff like that at 3 and available to them. This deck is just, it doesn't have those things available, and now it can't even compete with tier limits, which is unfortunate for itself. This is another deck. I'm going to put it in consider building something else because I said I would last time. This is a worse version of tier limits. Unfortunately, at some point they actually gave up on this deck, which was actually, I do know when. The last time they really cared about trying to make this deck better was, I want to say like 2017. They made the Twilight Sworns, and the Twilight Sworns just, they weren't good enough. Like, they were really not good. Like, all of a sudden you got to banish things. It's like, wait a second, I thought we were sending in a graveyard. What happened? But yeah, the tier limits is literally in every single way a better version of Light Sworns. Like, they could have taken the tier limit cards, ripped off the artworks, like literally taken the artworks off, posted some Light Sworn monsters over those artworks, and I would have thought it was like Light Sworn support. Like, it is that good in Light Sworns, and it's just so lackluster and like other way. Like these cards are just, they would have been such great Light Sworn monsters, but they're just its own archetype, and that archetype is just 100 times better than, unfortunately, Light Sworns. And like I've said before, Light Sworns need more support. They need some special summons. They are too normal summon reliant, and they're too reliant on like too many stupid bricks like Wolf and stuff like that. Whereas, like, if you notice, like the monsters that summon themselves from graveyard in this deck are bricks. You can't use them, like Felice, like Wolf. They're bricks. In tier limits, this deck wasn't made in 2008. This deck was made in 2022. So it doesn't have any of those idiotic bricks. Like, the bricks in this deck have hand effects. Like, it's insane. They special summon themselves. They actually do something. So in every single way, tier limits is a better version of Light Sworns. Unfortunately, play that. Raid Raptors, I'm going to be honest with you, I don't know how tier limits really affect or unaffect this deck, but I would imagine the graveyard is probably pretty important. I have not played this deck since this new season began. Like, in terms of like me playing against it, I've not run into this deck once. This deck has been a ghost. No one's seen it. Eldritch is another casualty. I usually put in tier 3, tier 2, depending on the metagame. This is another rogue deck, straight up rogue deck. Like this, I might even put it low. Like tier limits is so good against this deck, and the Ishizu cards are so good against this deck because a lot of the trap cards activate in the end phase. So before the end phase arrives, you just shuffle their trap cards back into the deck with the Ishizu cards, and then they can't get off their effects, which is pretty good. And then on top of that, you can shuffle back Eldritch the Golden Lord. You can even, like, your opponent has Eldritch the Golden Lord in the graveyard. They activate the effect of Eldritch the Golden Lord. They send one of their trap cards to the graveyard. You can activate the Ishizu Shuffler and shuffle both of those things right into the deck. Eldritch never comes out, and the trap card's gone. So your opponent just goes -2 off of a card that you just threw away, just kind of sent to the graveyard. It's insane. On top of that, all of the floodgates are hit. Literally all of the floodgates are either at 1 or semi-limited or limited. In some way, every floodgate is hit, so you couldn't even, like, those, again, one of the best things against tier limits of floodgates, not available to you. Next is Bee Troopers. Bee Troopers are a mess. They're the best insect archetype, but that's not saying much. Again, like, they weren't really all that great before, so Ishizu just makes the situation worse. Goki is power corrupt. It's definitely consider building something else. It is a link spam archetype, and I would highly advise you to play Spirals instead. Next is Monarchs, another deck that needs the graveyard, doesn't special summon, which is good, but again, it special summons mildly, but it needs the graveyard. You can't run D-Shifter. It is just, honestly, I'm going to put this in consider building something else. It's a tribute summon deck that is in almost every way worse than Floowandereeze. Now, this consider building something else just means that there is a deck out there that is higher up that is much better than the deck that is down here. That doesn't mean that Monarchs are worse than Amazonas, for example. It just means that there is a better option available to you, just so we're clear. DDDs. Woof, my brain already hurts. This deck, incredibly high skill. Here's the problem. This is another one of those situations. Watching two people play this deck, it's like, you're not going to keep up. Let's be honest. It is an extremely high skill deck. It is one of my favorite decks to watch play. It's like, it takes an incredible intellect. Jimmy Neutron couldn't play this deck. This deck is one of the, you have to be incredibly intelligent to play this deck. This deck has cards like tier limit cards, but they have restrictions. Unfortunately, they have restrictions, so they're not as good. They literally have fusion monsters that activate in the graveyard, but you have to banish for costs. They're once per turn. You can't activate them the turn they're like. There's restrictions on the cards, unlike, of course, the Ishizu cards and the tier limit cards. But yeah, this deck is just, as much as I like it, it's just not a great meta for the deck. I'd say it's probably somewhere, if we're being realistic, the better decks against it are the ones that can run D-Shifter and Floodgates. This deck is probably somewhere around here. I think it's better than Dinosaurs in this particular meta, but I think it's still in Rogue. We're running out of space. We're just going to cover tier limits because, let's be honest, we know what's up there. This deck sucks. This is Familiar, Possess, Charmers. The deck is always terrible. Your best case, it's basically a bunch of, like, I'm not even going to put it in consider building something else because it's just don't build it. It's just a bunch of... Altergeist does this, what this deck does, but better. Like, it's basically a bunch of vanilla monsters that aren't vanillas because they have a dumb effect that you'll never resolve on them. And the entire goal is to, like, activate Magician's right hand, Magician's left hand. What else is there? Secret Village and some other Floodgate, and that's basically the gameplay of the deck. Now, what is positive is all your cards suck, so you can play D-Shifter because it doesn't matter if they get banished because they all suck anyway. So you just D-Shifter, and if your cards get banished, listen, it's better for you. You shouldn't have had them in your deck anyway. So yeah, this deck's a mess. Neos is another mess. I'd say don't play Neos, play regular heroes. Unfortunately, they haven't released Air Neos, so we have to stage a protest. Something's not right there. Next is Fortune Ladies, another mess of a deck. Probably avoid it at all costs. Don't play it. Emancipators, tier 3. This is the other deck that you can play with the Ishizu cards and with the Vernusloofs. Very good deck, still very strong. You can take games off of tier limits, but it's going to take a little bit of a wiser mind. This is another deck that got hit. Block Dragon, I believe, is at 1. The Block Dragon got hit, and the other thing got hit, which is the Grassing Screen, and went to 2. But like, the deck's still playable, still good. Tunes, I can't put it in consider building something else because there's literally no other deck like it. It's a very creative, very fun deck. I love the deck a lot. The thing is, it's like, it's tough to say. Like, does this deck even, does Tier Limits even affect this deck? It's like, what are you gonna shuffle? You know, what are you gonna actually? You could shuffle Bookmark, and then they lose their protection on the Tune Table of Contents. I mean, sorry, you lose the protection on the Tune Kingdom. So like, in certain ways, it's actually pretty good against it. But overall, I think it's just kind of like where it's always been. This deck isn't like negatively affected by Tier Limits, which means it's probably somewhere in Rogue. Pendulums are another one that's just, I'd say it's probably, the good thing about Pendulums is the graveyard shuffling away doesn't really affect them that much, which is really good. But it's just, I'd probably put it somewhere like up here. The reality is the Tier Limit engine is just so much stronger than all the other decks that it doesn't even matter that Tier Limits themselves don't negatively affect Pendulums that much, because it's just, the engine in general is just so strong. I'd say this deck is probably, this is Heroes. I think this deck can actually be at the higher end of Rogue, just because the deck is, if you can make Darklaw is very good against Tier Limits. Very good against Tier Limits. And on top of that, if your opponent is milling your deck, if they mill something like a Shadow Mist, you actually get a graveyard effect. Vion, you get a graveyard effect. If they mill your stuff, sometimes it can actually be beneficial for you, which is really good. You know, it can actually end up, because the effects basically activate right away. It's not like they get activate when they're sent. So that can be actually pretty good. The other thing that this deck has is it doesn't have any negates, and it loses to Nibiru. Nobody's playing Nibiru, and the negates really don't matter because Tier Limits can play through negates. But this deck actually does, interestingly enough. I'm actually going to put it in Tier 3. I think it's actually a good call for this meta. What this deck actually does is it actually doesn't set up negates, and it doesn't set up all that many interruptions. What it basically sets up is permanent floodgates on monsters. So it sets up like Darklaw, which makes everything your opponent sends to the graveyard get banished instead. Very good against Tier Limits. It also makes it so if you summon Plasma, for example, you have Skill Drain on the field, plus you get to steal a monster. It's like a Thousand Eyes Restrict effect. So it can actually be somewhat beneficial against Tier Limits. I'd say it's probably a Tier 3 deck. It's out of all the anime decks, it probably has the best like actual matchup against Tier Limits. Next is Shaddoll. Shaddoll actually isn't that bad, but I wouldn't recommend playing pure Shaddolls. Shaddolls can easily be put and consider building something else, because Tier Limits is literally just Shaddolls but better. No one actually uses the flip effects of Shaddoll monsters anymore. Most people use the graveyard effects and then just summon Window. So it can honestly be put and consider building something else, and I think you should play Tier Limits instead. I have seen people play Tier Limits with Shaddolls, and to some success. Like the cards do actually benefit from being milled. Now the issue is if you brick off of too many Shaddol cards, it can actually kind of kill you. The other cool thing that you can do is you can end on a Window in Tier Limits, which can be very good in the mirror match. So I'd say it's definitely consider building something else, or consider including it with Tier Limits, but don't try to play it pure. I don't think it's as good. Blue Eyes is another one. It's the bottom of Rogue this time. This deck heavily relies on the graveyard. The other thing is it was made in 2016, so the Ishizu Shufflers absolutely smack the shit out of this deck, because if you send a White Stone of Ancients to the graveyard, it doesn't activate until the end phase. So before the end phase even arrives, your opponent can just shuffle that right back into the deck, and you don't get to summon anything, and it's never a good time. Beast Dweller's running around, bad against this deck. And then you have to keep in mind the decks that are good against Tier Limits that people are now playing. So people are playing D-Shifter, which hurts Blue Eyes. So they're playing D-Shifter to beat Tier Limits, but their D-Shifter is actually going to beat your Blue Eyes deck. So if you're not playing against Tier Limits, which runs a bunch of Floodgates and Shufflers, then you're playing against the cards that are good against Tier Limits, which also hurt Blue Eyes, it's a recipe for disaster. Next is Wind-Ups. This is another deck that's like, it needs the graveyard. If you can't have the graveyard, life sucks. Wind Witches are more of an engine than a deck. You include it in wind-based decks. It's fairly decent. Doesn't really use the graveyard. Pretty resilient against Floodgates, if we're being honest. Like, overall a really good engine, just not really that good of a pure deck. Phantasm Spirals, I have a build that I've been coming up with. It is the most anti-tier limit deck you've ever seen in your entire life. I'm probably going to post it at some point on the channel. This deck is absolutely disgusting against tier limits because nothing tier limits does actually negatively impacts this deck. Like literally nothing at all. Graveyard Shuffling doesn't matter. You can play D-Shifter. You can play Macrocosmos. You can play Dimensional Fissure. You can play all of the floodgates that actually hurt tier limits and hurt every other deck on this list. Like, this is the most anti-meta deck in the entire game. It might actually have a matchup against tier limits that's actually quite good. The only thing is the deck is naturally prone to bricking sometimes, and sometimes it can have trouble going second. Now, what's good about it is again pretty good against tier elements. So because again, he didn't even activate any monster effects. That's what's great. So they can't even like, oh, have this. There's no point. You can't do it. You're never going to activate a monster effect in this deck. So it's really good for that. Oh no, Infernoid's another one. Tier element shufflers, not tier element. It's Shizu shufflers. Absolutely like pulverize this deck. Like you work so hard to activate a reasoning and resolve it, and then everything that you milled, you lose because of an Ichizu Shuffler or Olympus Dweller or some other form of anti-tier limit or tier limit card. Next is Subterror. Subterror is a weird one. I'd say it's probably somewhere at the higher end of Rogue. It can main deck a bunch of floodgates, and that's a positive characteristic of the deck. And outside of that, it really is. It's one of the real like real anti-meta decks. It can also, the thing that it's really been missing is the Dragoon, which still for some reason is not in the game. Like, we have tier limits, the best deck of all time, but we can't have Dragoon. It's idiotic. Next is Spirals. I'd say it's probably like a rogue deck. It's a rogue link deck. It's probably one of the better like pure link decks that are available out there. Your opponent will mill your master plan, stuff like that, which can actually come to your benefit. But again, Shizu Shufflers, not good. Battery Men, don't play them. Play Thunder Dragons instead. Elemental Lords was one of the worst archetypes to ever come out. I would say that this would be the matter to play it because your opponent will mill your stuff for free, but your opponent will also shuffle your stuff for free. So as hard as it is to already, like, this is another deck that, like, it needs support in the form of, like, in the same way that Lightsworns need support. Lightsworns are a mess because it doesn't have a lot of great starters. This deck has no starters, like literally nothing. There's nothing like mill 5 cards, like nothing. Like the deck expects you to have all of these monsters in the graveyard, but doesn't give you any way to put them there. You just have to, like, you know, let's wait till turn 10 and see how many monsters we have, and then we're playable. Like it's too slow. It's a mess. Altergeist is a good deck. It's getting new support in the OCG in a few months, which means it's getting new support in the TCG in probably 6 months, and it means it's getting new support in Master Duel in probably a year. So in a year, I'll probably move this up from Rogue. Next is Blackwings, getting new support soon. I'm going to put it probably somewhere around here. Good deck, not great. The new support will definitely help. FAs, this is another deck. It sucks. Again, this is another deck that the hit on the ban list, the Foolish Burial Goods getting hit to 1. Foolish Burial Goods was very, very needed in this deck. It's very important in this deck. Without that, it's a lot of those graveyard effects that this deck has, a lot of the starters, unfortunately, are less usable, and it just by chance just got hit on the ban list that wasn't meant to hit it. Next is Magical Musketeers. Really not affected by the Shizu Shufflers. It can play D-Shifter. It can honestly could do a lot of things. I'm probably going to put it somewhere in like the higher end of Rogue, but overall the deck is just not that great. It's column based, and if your opponent just knows not to be an idiot and activating your columns, most of the time you're going to end pretty well. And the other problem with this card is it's very normal summon reliant. So sometimes you'll normal summon like you're going to normal summon a monster, and if your opponent just knows that you're going to normal summon a Magical Musketeer monster, and if your opponent knows that you're going to go into the link 1, then they will just like bounce it or destroy it. Just as long as your opponent knows what they're doing against this deck, it's usually not going to end very well when you're going second. Next is These are the Cyber Angels. I always put these in consider building something else because as a pure deck, they're just not that strong. Drytron is a lot better. This is Time Thieves. Time Thieves is a really cool archetype, but unfortunately, it just doesn't have any like real good boss monsters. Now you're gonna say, whoa, what do you mean it doesn't have a good boss monster? It has Time Thief Redoer, one of the best XC monsters of all time. That is true, but the problem is it doesn't have any like that card is good as a generic rank 4 monster, but it's not actually good in this deck as a boss monster. That card is never a boss monster. It's a monster that you put onto the board if you happen to end on 2 level 4 monsters, because it can do a lot of really good stuff for you. But unfortunately, this deck, like I said, it's missing its boss. It's missing a negate, can't be destroyed by card effects, something like that. As good as this card is in other decks, it's actually just okay in its own deck. Dragon Link is a very high skill deck, very much hit by the Shuzu Shufflers, because you do need your graveyard. Graveyard is everything in Dragon Link. It's all of its recursion. Instant Fusion's gone. A few different hits really suck for Dragon Link. I definitely put it somewhere in Rogue. It's a very high skill deck. It's even more high skill. It's actually less high skill now, because if your cards get shuffled away, you can forget your graveyard effects. Who cares about my graveyard effects? I'm never going to be able to resolve them. So unfortunately, that sucks. They can shuffle away like Chaos Space before you can actually banish it and use its effect. It's not a quick effect. You can banish things away before you can use the field spell. Boot set to the launch to summon it back. I mean, it just kind of sucks, man. It really does. Photon / Galaxy is in a similar position to Blue Eyes. It's kind of like, it's a bunch of bricky level 8, level 5 monsters that need the graveyard, and if you lose the graveyard, it's just not going to go well for you. Cyber Dragon is a going second deck. Going second against Tearlaments is like running barefoot into hell. It's just never fun. It's just not going to end well for you. You have to play the Trap Stun version of it, which is the going second Trap Stun version. This deck is also missing still. I forget, it's a new card that turns all monsters on the field into machines. I forget its name, but that card is imperative in this deck. It's a continuous spell. It actually got leaked like 6 months ago, and like, oh, it's coming to Master Duel. Still isn't here. We don't know when we're going to get it, but that this deck needs that card quickly. Jinzo is like it's not as bad as Final Countdown, because you're not lasting 20 turns against Tearlaments, but it's still very bad because Tearlaments use like one trap card and then the graveyard effect of that trap card. So maybe when we have a trap heavy meta, this deck will actually be good, but as of right now, I don't think it's going to happen. Also, you have Gravekeepers, which is good in a graveyard using meta, but it's still not good. So we'll have to see. It's another one of those things where you want Jinzo during your opponent's turn, but it's already too late. Predaplant's another deck hit on the ban list by chance. Stray Bullet. It's probably in like Rogue. It has a decent matchup against Tearlaments because it plays like Super Poly, stuff like that. It's all searchable. Here's the problem. It lost Instant Fusion. And you're probably saying, well, Instant Fusion's at 1. Not in Predaplants. Not in Predaplants. That thing was searchable. You normal summon Orpha Scorpio, summon Darling Cobra, use the once per duel effect to search Instant Fusion, activate Instant Fusion, go directly into the level 5 monster. It's a combo. It's a nice, beautiful combo starter. It was a needed piece at 1. It was a fair card. No one complained about Instant Fusion. Tearlaments messed that up. I almost tears. There's tears running down my face. Dragon Maids. I forgot all about this deck. I don't even know why it's here. Another deck that needs the graveyard, loses to both Tearlaments and the cards that are good against Tearlaments, and it's in a similar position to Blue Eyes. Like, this deck is better than Blue Eyes. Like, if you play against Blue Eyes, you'll win against Blue Eyes, but again, this is all in relation to the overall general metagame, which the general metagame is Tearlaments. Mathmech used to be a very good deck. Now it's with the Shufflers. It's probably somewhere at the top of Rogue. Still a very strong deck. Can beat most of the... This deck, had Tearlaments not come out, would probably be like a top 5 deck. But with Tearlaments, it's like... God, man. Dark Magician needs Dragoon badly. You have Magician Souls, which sends Dark Magician just to the graveyard, just for your opponent to shuffle it back. Always fun. Yeah, this is... Please come out with Dragoon, guys, please. Aromatherapy is consider building something else, and the deck you should play instead is somewhere down here, Rika's. I'm just going to handle this now. Rika's are much better, and I think the new Sullivan monster just came out. Rika's are a very good deck. I would actually put this probably somewhere up here. It has a decent matchup against tier elements. A decent matchup. Not a great matchup. A decent matchup. You can play some floodgates in it, like goes in match. All of your Rikas are water. Most of what you're ending on is going to be the Rika monsters. Yeah, you go into the Sun Avalon sometimes, but you mostly go into waters. Rivalry, all that stuff, you can actually main deck that. So those cards are fairly good against it. The deck actually is pretty good. It can tribute your opponent's monsters for cost. If you're tributing your opponent's monster for cost, their tier limit effects don't trigger, because they only trigger if they get sent to the graveyard by card effect. So you can tribute their monster for cost, not trigger their effect, and get rid of their monster. It's incredible. Very good matchup sometimes against tier elements. But if tier elements go first, it's never fun. Kwakimeru is avoid at all. It's not even an archetype. I put this, and I don't know why I added this. It's literally not an archetype. Yeah, you use some of the rock Kwakimeru monsters in Adamantimators. You don't actually play pure. You don't play this deck pure. You would never play this deck pure. You'd have to be crazy. Next is this is Trap Tricks. This deck is going to get significantly better when they release the stuff from the structure deck. So this deck will get better. We just don't know when. We'll find out. We just don't know when. But that deck will get better. But as of right now, it's just kind of rogue. It's okay. It's a deck that needs to go first. If it goes second, have fun. Another deck that just loses to these Shizu Shufflers, Phantom Knights. Sorry, guys. I know it's a cool deck. I know. Next is... This is literally just a worse version of Dragon Link wherever I put it. Dragon Link is literally just a better version of Dragoonity. It's like Dragoonity plays a couple of wing beasts, and Dragon Link only plays dragons. It's just a worse version. But it's still a good deck. Like, you still have to respect it. It's still good. It just ends on different negates, and it's not as consistent. Basically, that's it. Next is this deck. Oof. Again, if you're not losing to Ichizus, you're losing to tier limits, and if you're not losing tier limits, you're losing to the decks that beat tier limits. So definitely a rogue deck now. One season ago, I put this in what, tier 2? Maybe I put it maybe even tier 1. This deck was very good with the sprite cards, but obviously that's gone. This is another deck that's gone too. This is Burning Abyss, just not a great matchup against tier elements or their counters. Ignoble Knights, these are going to get support in Japan in 3 months, which means they're going to get support in the TCG in 6 months and in Master Duel in a year, and then the deck will be a lot better. This deck is actually quite good against tier elements, and Banshee is actually a quick effect to activate, which is pretty cool. So as soon as it hits the graveyard, you can banish it for cost, and then activate the zombie world immediately. So this deck is actually quite good. I'd say it's probably in tier 3. You can't mix it with Eldritch anymore because it's just been hit a variety of ways. You can no longer play Rivalry because, I mean, you can play it, but you only have 1 copy. Yeah, I'd say it's probably somewhere in tier 3, probably the very, very, very end of tier 3. And it's actually quite good with the Ichizu cards. I should probably do a deck profile on this deck too. I do have those cards. Next is Sword Soul. This is a deck that used to be like, I've never put it below tier 3, but it just, like, it doesn't particularly get hurt by the, like, it does get hurt by the Ichizu cards and the anti-tier limit cards, where basically it loses the Tenyis, which sucks because Tenyis are really, really important. Tenyis give you the bounce. Tenyis give you the Ashuna plays to special summon the deck. Like, Tenyis do give you some important, it gives you the other one, the little one, I forgot its name, Ashana maybe, I forget which one it is, the little Tenyi, the one that adds back a banish. Like, all of those are important. If your opponent can just shuffle them back, it's never good. Like, the deck is still a strong deck, and if it goes first, it could probably win against tier limits, but like, it's still gonna have a very rough road. This deck is too fair of a meta deck. Like, it's one of those decks that doesn't really need to be hit, because all it basically does is end on a Blackout, a Barone, and a Chow Fang. Like, it ends on basically 3 interruptions, and maybe a hand trap. And that's just, it's not enough to compete against Tier Elements, because Tier Elements can play right through that with their eyes closed. Sylvans, consider building something else. Don't play this deck pure. Simply play Rika's. Avoid the Heartache. Next is, this deck is just okay. It's a dinosaur deck that's just okay. I actually think in this current meta it might be better. It might actually be better to play it than regular dinos, but it's not by much. Next is, this sucks. This really sucks to do, but I honestly think that Despia is like a rogue deck. The Chizu Shufflers absolutely pulverize this deck, but here is the silver lining. This deck is going to get support very soon when the Bystials drop. And when the Bystials drop, this deck is going to be kicking Tearlaman's butt very, very much, because those Bystials literally destroy Tearlamans. Oh, you know, they send Tearlaman monster, cool. Bystial, bam, banish it right out of the graveyard, and you get the special summon, and you get the search. It's insane. So this deck will be beating Tearlaments whenever they decide to drop it. The problem is we're on a different schedule than the TCG, so we don't actually know when it's supposed to be out. Like, theoretically speaking, the Bystial should have actually come out with the Tearlaments, but unfortunately it's all kind of out of order. Thunder Dragons are kind of like somewhere up here. Like, Colossus doesn't do that much against Tearlaments, but it's okay. Like, the deck's okay. The shuffling away really hurts it, because unfortunately, the shuffling away is a real problem, because you want your cards to either get banished or you want them to be sent to graveyard. You do not want them back in the deck. That doesn't help anybody to put those monsters back in the deck. Especially Thunder Dragons, they're bricks. You don't want them back in the deck. You keep them there. So that is definitely in Rogue. This has fallen off so badly. I remember this was the best deck. The Alistair and Friends deck, again, there's just a better fusion deck. It's right here. You know, there's a better fusion deck. It's right here. Like, this is just not that good of a fusion deck anymore. It ends on one negate and an Alistair in hand. It's just, it's not enough, honestly. Next up, we've got the Birds. This is another deck that just got hit too badly. It lost a barrier statue, and it never really recovered since then. No one's really played it that aggressively. That or the Tri-Brigades, and both decks have just been kind of like less playable. They did bring, I think, Tenki, Fire Formation Tenki to 3, which is good for Tri-Brigade, but unfortunately it's like, if your opponent can just shuffle everything back before you can activate Revolt, like, it just sucks for you. Salamangrade's good in the Attribute 4 thing, but just not good right now. I'd say it's probably somewhere in Rogue. Again, your graveyard getting shuffled back, Bistweller, like, none of that stuff is good for you. This is another deck that's decent with Tri-Brigades, but Tri-Brigades are not in a great state right now. This is another deck that's just really... This deck is... I almost feel bad for Sky Strikers. Like, I personally don't like the deck, but I feel bad for them, because the next few metagames are just going to be so bad for Sky Strikers. So right now, you have people shuffling back your Ray. That's a problem. The next metagame is going to be the Bystials, which are going to be people banishing your Ray. And then after that, it's going to be Kashtira, which is going to be people locking out your zone so you can't activate Spawn Trap card. The next 3 metagames are just going to be horrific for Sky Strikers. And they're a very normal summon reliant deck, because drones is at 1. So you can't even like, oh, I'm going to Lava Golem, then I'm going to normal summon right, because you can't normal summon if you summon Lava Golem. So it's like, this is going to be a really, really tough, probably 9 months for Sky Strikers, if I'm being honest. It's probably somewhere in Rogue, because it's always going to be in Rogue. It's a deck that can basically play through anything if you have a good pilot, but overall the deck is not in a great place. This is another deck that's just really, really badly impacted by the Shufflers. It's probably somewhere in Rogue. You need the graveyard, and for recursion, if they can just shuffle back your graveyard, well, there's all your recursion. Next is Utopia. I'd say it's probably in the same place it's always been. It's not particularly hurt by the graveyard effects, but doesn't have a great matchup against the metagame, so it just kind of stays where it is. Gladiator Beasts are probably somewhere in the same place I usually put them, in Rogue. You can play them with the Tri-Brigades, but unfortunately the Tri-Brigades, like I said, not in a great place right now. Plunder Patrol has a decent matchup against Tier Limits. I'd probably say Plunder Patrol is somewhere up here. It's actually a half decent deck to play right now because it does have some graveyard effects, but it's not like super graveyard reliant to the point where it will lose to any sort of graveyard interruption. Sharks, absolutely 100% need Totally Awesome back. That was their only negate, and now they're basically... the crazy thing is the deck used to be Goes in Match and Totally Awesome. Like, that was the deck. It was you summoned Totally Awesome, block him with Shark, and you protected your Goes in Match. And that was basically all you did with the deck. With that stuff gone, the deck's identity is gone, and basically now the deck is just kind of like... it's up in the air. I played against it, and it basically had a bunch of different floodgates, and it was a mess. The deck needs Totally Awesome back. Orcus is another deck absolutely demolished by the Shizu cards. Like, it's bad. It really, really got hit bad by the Shizu cards, because if you don't have the field spell up that makes your effects quick effects, you can't even start your engine. Like, you literally cannot do anything, and it really sucks for the deck because they got some cards lifted off the ban list just last time. The other thing is the Orcus Mech Knight monster is still, for some reason, I believe it's either limited or semi-limited, which is like, why? Why is it limited? It's basically paying for the sins of like 2019 Yu-Gi-Oh! Like, bring it back. Come on, it's outrageous. And it's not even, it's like 2019 OCG Yu-Gi-Oh! That this deck is paying sins for, when in reality it's not that good of a deck. Next we've got Unchained. Now, how are you going to float into monsters if your opponent's shuffling things back? How are you going to do it? You're not. Your opponent will shuffle things, and it's very unfortunate for the deck. Like, the deck is actually... it has an okay matchup against most of the metagame, including Tier Elements, but I'd say it's probably still somewhere in Rogue. It is getting new support. Again, I'm going to give you the same speech. We're probably going to get it in like a year. Next is this deck. This is... I forgot their names. The Amusement Park deck. It's a trap deck, but I forgot the name. It's an okay trap deck. I wouldn't say it's like great. I think there are better trap decks to play. I think the better trap deck is honestly Labyrinth. Labyrinth just is in every way a better deck than this deck. It's a trap deck that just doesn't live up to other trap decks. This is another deck that can do well against Tier Limits. I'd say it's probably somewhere in the higher end of Rogue. If you go first and you make a Shen, you can very much win against Tier Limits. But the problem is the graveyard shuffling really doesn't help because, again, you kind of need the stuff in the graveyard because you want to banish it you want to banish it yourself. You don't want your opponent to shuffle it back. So that's kind of an issue for you. But overall, I think the deck, if you can summon a Shen, has a very good matchup against Tier Limits. Going second is just very rough against them. Ghost Trick, I'm not even going to waste time. It's a complete disaster. Of a deck. I've never seen anyone successfully run it in anything above like gold. Really not that good. This is Marincess. We've got Marincess, honestly, somewhere like... it's basically a deck that ends on a... it ends on a monster that's unaffected by everything as long as you keep your field spell on the board that is equipped with multiple monsters that has a spell trap or negate. It is just not enough to actually compete against the stronger decks in the game. Like, it's a good deck in like some sort of a limited fashion. Like in if Attribute 4 didn't hit this deck, it would probably be one of the better decks to play in Attribute 4. But because it did get hit, this deck is kind of like not as good. Next is Machina. Machina's in a decent place. I'd say it's probably like the higher end of Rogue. Machina or Trains or the Earth Machine in general is pretty good because you can play the Ichizu cards, the Vernus Loops. You can play all that stuff to mill your stuff, and then you can get the engine going pretty well. The drawback to this deck is it takes a long time to play, and you really don't end on that much. Your board is kind of lackluster, but overall I'd say it's probably somewhere up there. Tri-Brigades, I keep saying, is just very much hurt by the Tier Element Shufflers because the entire point of your board is to end on Wing Beasts and Beasts and all that stuff in your graveyard and your Banish Pile, summon them back, and then special summon a monster. But if your opponent can just shuffle them in the standby phase, it's just not going to even work out for you. Next is Mech Knights, which I'd say are probably somewhere in Rogue. Going second right now is absolutely horrific, and this deck must go second. Weather Painters relies on Skill Drain. Skill Drain got hit to 2. I don't know what to tell you. Like, without Skill Drain, this deck isn't again, it's in a really, really bad place. You can play some of the other floodgates like Rivalry. I mean, Gozen Match. You can play things like not Gozen Match. You can play things like Macrocosmos, stuff like that. The problem with Macrocosmos is, again, it's really only good going first. It's not really great going second. So Rogue it is. This deck is good against spawn trap card decks, Harpies that is. It's good against spawn trap card decks. This is not a spawn trap card meta, so unfortunately it's kind of stuck here in Rogue. You can make Abyss Dweller very easily, which is helpful because it's good against tier elements, but if you're not playing against tier elements, then it's just a monster that does nothing. Runic is just completely fell off. They've hit it on the ban list so many times. Not only did they hit it on the ban list, but they hit a bunch of other things on the ban list to hit this deck, which is kind of one of the frustrating things that they do. So they've hit things like Skill Drain and Gozen and stuff like that on the ban list because people were complaining about it because they were playing Runic, and your opponent would be playing Runic. They would activate like 3 floodgates, and then they would activate the Runic Fountain to deck you out while you were trying to get rid of the floodgates. The problem was Runic. It really wasn't the floodgates, because the floodgates aren't a problem if they don't have a win condition. Runic gave floodgate decks a win condition, so they ended up hitting not only all of the floodgates, but a bunch of the Runic stuff. They hit a bunch of different stuff, and in reality, if they just hit the Runic stuff, they didn't have to hit any of the other stuff. So now we're kind of, because of Runic is a lot of the Runic is kind of the source of a lot of the issues that we have in the metagame right now, because they hit a lot of the floodgates that would typically have stopped tier elements, but because those are gone, all of the like Rogue decks that would have been able to compete are now stuck down here in Rogue, because it's just like all of the outs to tier element are basically gone. And Runic is a part of that. And the other thing is, now tier limits have gotten a bunch of cards hit that affect Rogue decks that don't actually affect tier limits all that much, which is, again, pretty frustrating. Naturia is still waiting for its other support. When it gets its other support, it will be pretty good. I'd say just wait for that support. This is a Abyss Megalo. This is a Mermill deck. It's really good in the Attribute 4. Really good in the Attribute 4 thing. But it's not all that great as a deck right now. Cleave Forts are just an okay deck. It's a Pendulum deck, so nothing can be shuffled. It can play all of the outs to tier elements, which is really good. So I'd say I'd probably put it a little higher. It's pretty good against, like I said, if you can play D-Shifter and Macrocosmos and all that stuff is very good against tier elements. So I'd probably put it somewhere in Rogue. Red Eyes is a mess right now. Definitely, it's probably somewhere near Blue Eyes. It's just like losing your graveyard hurts too much, and not having Dragoon hurts even more. So I'd say probably Red Eyes. I'd say play Dragon Link instead, and Dragon Link honestly isn't even in a great place. This is a avoid at all costs. Do not play pure artifacts. It's just, I don't even know why you would do that to yourself. Another deck hurt by the Shufflers. I'd say it's probably somewhere in Rogue. Decent deck, but really not like amazing in this metagame right now. The big ships not being able to be targeted really doesn't matter all that much, so I'd say it's probably somewhere in Rogue. Speedroid's definitely a Rogue deck right now, because again, it's like a decent build a board synchro deck, but not a great deck in this current metagame. It's just like, yeah, you can make Barone and maybe a couple other negates, but it's again, tier limits is just too strong, and getting rid of your graveyard at any given time is too good. Blackluster Soldier's waiting for new support. When that comes out, we will readdress that. Consider building something else is Sharanui's. I think you should instead just play the Zombie World deck, and with Zombie World you could actually mix in some of the Sharanui's, and it's actually quite good. This is Viacroids. They suck. They've sucked for years. They sucked when they came out. They sucked years later. This deck is just terrible. It's like stuck in like it's stuck in 2003 and it came out in 2006. This deck is just, it's stuck in the past. It's not good. Magician Girls are another deck that are just a horrific, useless deck. They gave the Dark Magician Girl its own archetype, and they gave her like the worst cards you could possibly imagine. The deck is just not very good at all. Definitely not worth making. The best one is Chocolate Magician Girl, and it's not even that good. Next is, this is True Dracos. Like, I'd say it's a decent deck. It's not particularly hurt by tier limits, but it's hurt by the cards that hurt tier limits. So I'd say it's probably in Rogue, but in reality you should probably play if you like tribute summoning decks, you should probably play Floowandereeze instead. Buster Blader is just not very playable right now. Graveyard is key for this deck. Without the graveyard, you lose. This is Digital Bugs is consider building something else, and what you should play is wherever I put the other insect deck, the Bee Troopers. Wherever I put Bee Troopers, play that instead of this. This deck is just too slow. Next is consider building something else. Is unfortunately the Paleozoics, because they got hit so many different times with stray bullets that it kind of sucks. The deck got hit when they lost Totally Awesome. The deck got hit when it lost Grass Looks Greener, so unfortunately the deck is in consider building something else. This is another rogue deck. It's going second, 8 axis. Basically it's a rank 8 deck with Fairy Tail Luna. I'd say it's a decent deck, but again, going second right now is just not very easy. A lot of the generic destruction cards aren't even that good because they trigger a lot of the tier limit effects. So if you Lightning Storm your opponent, it's like, oh cool, no problem. Now I have graveyard effects that activate. I'm going to be able to mill 5. I'm going to be able to fuse. I'm going to be able to search a tier limit card. Like literally, like Harpy's Feather Duster and all of these other cards do absolutely nothing against tier limits. So even Kaiju's, like a lot of this stuff just doesn't do anything against tier limits. So unfortunately, it's stuck in Rogue. Exodia, you're not making Exodia. You're not drawing Exodia. It's not happening. I'm sorry. It's just not a coherent strategy outside of like, I don't even know, Rookie. Spellbooks are kind of like a decent deck. I'd say wait for the Dogmatica support. It will get significantly better. Going second decks in general are a mess. I'd say this includes one of them, which is the Crusadia OTK deck. Nice cheap deck, but I think it's a little tough to pull out in this metagame. This is another deck that I would say losing the Prank Kid Meow Meow to 1 hurt the deck significantly, and then it lost all of the various different pieces throughout time, so I'd probably say it's somewhere in Rogue. Next we've got Zodiacs. Zodiacs are a decent like going second deck. You can play D-Shifter. It would be awesome if D-Shifter was at 3 so they can actually really utilize D-Shifter. So I'd probably say it's somewhere here. You can make D-Shifter, go second, make a Zeus, attack, send everything, and banish everything. So it's pretty cool in that regard. Endymion is the best pendulum deck available to you. I'd probably say it's wherever I put the other pendulum, somewhere around here. Best pendulum deck out there, I think Endymion by far. And it sucks. That was another hit that it kind of took. It sucks that they lost Instant Fusion, because Instant Fusion was really good. You can make Millennium Eyes and as a free spellcaster. I already rated this. It's a repeat. I already rated this. It's a repeat. This deck isn't consider building something else. You should build regular Earth Machines. They play all of the different Earth Machine monsters, including some of the gear monsters. So definitely build that instead. I put that somewhere. I put this right here. So at the top of Rogue, the higher end of Rogue. So definitely don't build this deck. Just going second is bad, and your best monster is Ancient Gear Chaos Giant, and unfortunately Ancient Gear Chaos Giant is really bad against tier limits, like just really bad. Next is this deck can make a couple of interruptions. It would be better if Crystron Heck Lefibrex wasn't banned. The deck can make a couple of interruptions, like a 2-card combo, usually end on 3 or 4 negates, but that's uninterrupted, assuming everything goes well, so probably somewhere in Rogue. Libromancers are still missing something key. It's not as good as Drytron. So yeah, I think it really is missing something. I don't know what it is, but it is. Next is ABC's. Decent deck, but way too badly hurt by the shufflers. If your opponent just shuffles your stuff back into the deck when you put like 2 pieces in graveyard, it really hurts because there's no way coming back from that. Next is rank 10 trains. I'd say trains are somewhere around. I'd just say play trains with the Earth Machine deck altogether. Don't play it pure, just kind of play trains. Because you're going to be able to make the trains there anyway. Don't play this deck pure, but I would say again, this card has its place, which is the Therion King Regulus. You play it in Cyber Dragon. You can play it at Earth Machines. You can play it in a variety of different places, but just don't play it pure. I don't think that Therions are very good pure. Slifer is a good card on its own, but I don't think it's a good deck. Unfortunately, there's no like consistent ways to really search it or summon it. With outside of the Jax Knight and all of that stuff, there's no way to really like consistently play this deck. This is another kind of rogue deck. They do benefit from getting sent to graveyard, but not as much as the tier limit. So you're always playing catch up. I'd say it's probably at the higher end of rogue. Dark Magician I already reviewed. Abyss. This is the Red Dragon Archfiends, another deck that just, I like the design of the deck, but it's getting new support. I'd say it's probably at the lower end of rogue. It's getting new support, like I said, it's getting a structure deck, which means it's probably going to be getting like 5 or 6 new cards. We don't know all of them yet, so I'd say maybe a year from now I might be putting this up top, which is going to be pretty cool. Grand Maju is decent because it can, again, if you can banish your opponent's cards, it can usually be pretty good against tier elements and in the general metagame right now. So I'd say it can be a higher end rogue deck. But you really have to it has to be a very, very control based build. So you have to play like Summon Limit, Summoning Curse, stuff like that to actually be able to play it correctly. Winged Dragon of Ra just got new support in the last set. I don't think it was enough. It's probably somewhere in like middle of rogue. The deck, again, it's too risky of a deck. You pay so many life points, and then if you don't manage to kill your opponent, they will beat you the next turn because you're left with 100 life points. It's terrible. I wish you could just pay life points and choose the amount you pay rather than have to pay until you have 100 life points. This is another deck that's like, consider building something else, which is Dream Mirror. It's just not a very powerful deck. The artwork's very cool, but the ceiling on this deck is very, very low. It's just not a very strong deck. Next is Gem Knights. Just got new support, but I don't think it's that good. It used to be an FTK deck, but the FTK is a little hard to pull off. It has too many cards hit on the ban list, so I'd probably say it's like a lower end, kind of like a beat down rogue deck. I already reviewed this. This deck theoretically is one of those decks that should be good right now, but it's not, because again, your opponent shuffling back your spells before you can add them back during the end phase is not very good for you. On top of that, this deck is very consistent, like I always say, but it has a very, very low ceiling. It doesn't end on enough interruptions to make it actually like usable and strong, which really sucks for the deck. It really has this girl, her name starts with an H, she pops cards, and then you have another card that negates your opponent's monster effects, which again, it's too few interruptions to actually be good. Sylvans, I would say just again, play Rikas. Just no more plant decks. I mean, you could put this here, you can play like a plant link deck, but I would really recommend playing Rikas. They're probably much better. This is Ancient Warriors. It's really tough to go second right now. Really tough, not only to go second, but it's really tough to go second, and it's really tough to play against the Chizu Shufflers for this deck, and other decks like it. Unfortunately, it's a very going second is just not very easy right now. It's probably worse than ever, unless you're playing, unless you're playing tier limits. G Golem is a deck that's decent in the new event, but it's actually not that great in the general metagame. You can mix this with you can mix G Golems with the wherever I put them with Mathmex. You can mix G Golems with Mathmex, and it slightly raises the ceiling of Mathmex, but it makes them slightly more breaky. So you're getting a better ceiling with more protection, but unfortunately you might brick a little bit. Sue Ships, great for every single Sue Ships are great for every single event, it seems. This is probably the best deck to craft because every single event it's good, but generally speaking, it needs more monsters within its own archetype that are actually good. Unfortunately, the boss monsters in Sue Ships is not that good. Crawlers is a better version of Digital Bugs. I'd say it's probably at the lower end of Rogue deck. It's a flip effect deck, flip insect deck. Okay, but not that great. Skull Servants is another deck that could be good against tier elements. If they're milling your stuff constantly, it's good. But if they're shoveling your stuff constantly, then it's bad. So it could be good, it could be bad. Depends. This is the lower end of Rogue. As much as I like this deck, this was a structure deck that should not have come out. This should have been a Dark World structure deck. This should have been Should have been so many other structure decks. Dark World, Trap Tricks, like Crystal Beast structure deck. This could have been any other structure deck. And they released this structure deck, which is so weird because it has such a low power level compared to all the other structure decks. I have no idea why this was released as a structure deck. It's a going second deck that basically makes a Gaia the Fierce Knight. Yeah, Gaia the Fierce Knight, and then it attacks multiple times and gains attack when it attacks. Like, decent, cool deck, but I don't think it's strong enough to really compete against the biggest decks in the game. Numeron is in a bad place right now. I don't think it's in like low rogue, but it's definitely in like in worse place than it's been in the past. Unfortunately, milling your Numeron network is not good because you can't even play. You literally cannot play. If they mill your Numeron network, there's no way to really recur it. So you might only have one left in deck, and if you use that and you don't OTK, then you just lose. So not good. Next is Final Countdown. Is another one. You are not getting this off. You are not getting this off past like Silver. You're not getting Exodia off. You're not getting Final Countdown off. This is Destiny board. You are not getting this off. You're just not. This is a one-trick pony deck. This is Synchron. Unfortunately, this deck has become... you summon Junk Speeder. If your opponent negates it, you lose. If your opponent doesn't negate it, you win. That is the entire deck, and that is a huge design flaw. They really need to change the way this deck is played, because the way that it's played right now is incredibly linear, and it makes it very easy to beat, and it makes it very easy to lose with this deck, because everybody knows if you negate Junk Speeder, you basically have beat Synchrons, and that is just not a good design mechanic. The entire deck relies on one single card to resolve or not. These down here are all repeats. This has been the tier list. I'm sorry, I'm kind of losing my voice in the second half here. This has been the tier list. Unsurprisingly, the best deck is Tearlaments by a mile. Second best is Flunderies by another mile. And then these are all the decks that you sort of can play, and everything else basically goes into Rogue and gets worse and worse as the ban list actually goes into effect, unfortunately. Hopefully they hit Tearlaments, and hopefully they bring back some of the cards that they hit to try to hit Tearlaments, so that some of these other decks can actually come back and play again, because the ban list really is quite frustrating, unfortunately. But thank you for watching, and if you have any comments or anything, please let me know in the comment section down below, and thank you for watching. La, 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 la.